Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries. I'm Julie Cooper, a thriller writer and half of the duo bringing you this regular podcast series focused on mystery, suspense, and thriller fiction. First, our thanks to my brother Chris Squires for our theme song, The Man in the Panama Hat. Our theme for this episode is We All Have a Voice. I'll talk a little later about voice, that almost undefinable quality that some of our best writers possess. I'm also going to touch briefly on women's voices because that ties right into the time period of the mystery series our guest author writes about, and students' voices, given recent focus on the March for Our Lives events across the country. First, I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Jennifer Kincheloe. She's the author of a unique mystery series starting with The Secret Life of Anna Blanc, featuring, you guessed it, protagonist Anna Blanc, who starts out as a sheltered debutante from 1907's Los Angeles, a young woman who is raised to be decorative, not useful. Anna Blanc was never encouraged to use her voice, much less think that her voice was important. 1907 was the Edwardian era, although we don't call it that in the United States, and women lived small lives for the most part. With their hems down to the ground, women didn't work, didn't go to college, didn't have birth control, and didn't have the vote. Our guest author, on the other hand, has a PhD and has been the winner of the Murder and Mayhem Mystery Award and the Colorado Gold Award for Mystery. Welcome, Jennifer Kincheloe.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here.
And I'm going to jump in with a few questions for you, Jennifer. What gave you the idea for writing this series in this particular time, the early 1900s, before the Great War? Many of us, I think, know very little about those years, and there's literally no one left to ask who was alive during those times.
Well, I was looking for writing material. I was writing a screenplay. I wanted to write a screenplay, and I ran across this article about the first woman cop in Los Angeles. Her name was Alice Debon Wells, and she became a cop in 1910, and she was the impetus for this, what was a screenplay and is now a novel. I was so impressed with her because I could not imagine what it would take to be a successful woman police officer in 1910. And she was very successful. She traveled internationally promoting the cause of women officers and really changed the face of police work forever. So that was what got me interested in the era. Previously, I knew nothing about the era, but I did know my great-grandmother, and she was alive in Los Angeles, raising a family in the 1900s. So I feel like she's kind of a connection to the past for me. I touched this woman who would have been alive at the time of Anna Blanc, and there are a lot of primary sources still from the time that I could draw from.
Fascinating. Well, you have the details down so thoroughly, from the clothing to the social and sexual mores. And I've seen your wonderful website complete with photos showing fashion, food, some ridiculous hats, and even featuring music. How did you go about researching this period?
Well, I did a lot with the newspapers, which are very handily online and available for people to search. You can do a keyword search of the newspapers and specify what state, what years. And that was incredibly helpful for me. And just reading the newspapers, everything from the want ads to the advertisements to the society pages and the fashion pages and the news of the day. I read novels that were written in the period for people in the period. And that was a wonderful way of learning about customs and slang. I collected photographs, like you mentioned. I read court transcripts and congressional testimony. I read eyewitness accounts and memoirs. I read the memoirs of a prostitute, of a Chinese man who came to America and went to Yale. I read dissertations. And I read some books on the period, some scholarly works. I read a whole book on underwear. Anyway, there was a lot to read. Um, so, so yes, I spent more time researching than writing.
Interesting. And I guess a question that I didn't think about originally, but something you said triggered it is, when does a writer know when to stop? That's the ultimate challenge.
I heard someone say once, when you start discovering repeat, like when you're doing your research and you're just running across stuff you knew already, then you can probably stop.
That
But
makes sense. That
Um, you
makes
know,
sense.
I researched the first book and I had to learn about the progressive era and I had to learn about, the Anglo-Saxon American culture. And then when I went to write the second book, I had to learn the Chinese American experience, which was an entirely new research situation. I had to start all over again.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I spoke about voice earlier, and you've captured Anna's voice so well. I guess you could say she's one of the privileged 1%, only in 1907. From her original, very entitled self-absorption to her dawning enlightenment about women's rights and their place in society. And so I'm wondering, how will her views continue to evolve as the series progresses?
Well, I think Anna Blanc is going to surprise me. She's been a surprise all along. Surprise, she just, I didn't, when I started to write her, I was intending to write a very different character, but that's not who sprang onto the page. But I imagine her compassion will deepen. And I think she's been through a lot of trauma, and I think that trauma is going to leave some scars, and I haven't quite really worked out what that's going to look like. But the thing about Anna Blanc is she has a lot of room to grow.
And that's what makes it so intriguing. Now, you've said on your website that Anna has an insatiable desire to solve crimes, but I've got to believe she also has the desire to express herself after being so repressed by her father and by society. How much more trouble can she get into? I just can't wait to find out.
There's no limit to the trouble Anna Blanc could get into.
Good.
I think, yeah, as long as I live and can think of ways to get Anna in trouble, I will write more books. She, I don't know. I think the next book that I'm working on right now is kind of an exploration of morality and loyalty and what happens when they clash. So that's a little hint of some of the issues that Anna's going to be grappling with in book three, and that will definitely change her.
Great. Now, I know you have a doctorate and a background in academia and research. Explain to us how you went from academic nerddom, that's your word, to writing mysteries, especially about such an unusual protagonist.
So I'm more surprised that I became a research scientist than that I became a writer. And I think actually they both really surprised me because when I was growing up, girls weren't encouraged to become scientists. We really got the message that science was too hard for girls, and but I wasn't really encouraged to be a novelist either. And I think that's why it took me until my 40s to start writing. It just didn't occur to me that I would be able to do it. So, my path into academia, that was one path. And my path to becoming a writer really didn't start until I was, fully into my 40s. But when I started writing, I just couldn't stop. I just wrote all the time, and I had an illness and I was recovering and I wasn't working, so I had a lot of time on my hands, and I would just get up at 6 in the morning and I'd write till midnight. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd write. And I don't know why I have this gift slash curse of being a writer, but I do. Um,
A gift and a curse. I love that.
That's a
well,
good way to put it.
you
Yes.
guys understand this. I know you
We
do.
do, yes, indeed. Yes, truly. Well, your next book in the series, which I think you're going to read from to us in just a moment, is The Woman in the Camphor Trunk, based on a true crime story in Los Angeles. And I know that this book deals with discrimination and racial tension in early Los Angeles, mostly in the Chinese community. Can you talk to us a little bit about giving a voice to people from what was essentially a closed and very disenfranchised community?
It was enormously challenging. Book 2, the issues I dealt with in book 2 were way more challenging than the issues I dealt with in book 1. Of course, in book 1, I was learning how to write, so I had that challenge. But there was a Chinese language newspaper in Los Angeles, but to my knowledge, it's never been translated. I don't know if there are any copies left. And it was published by a Chinese Christian publisher with a very progressive political agenda with regards to the slave girls. So it may or may not have been very representative of the average non-Christian Chinese American man in Chinatown. But it doesn't matter because I can't get my hands on that. I did find a memoir written by a Chinese man who went to missionary schools in China and was sponsored and came and went to Yale. And so there's a character in the book, Mr. Jones, who's based on this real man. And I read his memoirs trying to get at what you're saying, what is the voice of these people? And the surprising thing to me is he didn't sound that different from me. I could really relate to the things he said and the way he thought. But I couldn't find sort of an authentic voice of a non-Christian, non-English speaking slave girl. And I had to use my imagination, and I had to set aside my stereotypes, which was a deliberate, conscious act. And one of those stereotypes is that a girl like that wouldn't have agency, and so the real life girls who my Sing Song girls are based on, because they were based on a real pair of young girls who were really beautiful and owned by one Tong leader and were stolen away by another Tong leader and taken to Los Angeles. And all of that's based on truth, but they were incredibly beautiful. And I really played that down because I tried not to sexualize them.
Right.
I tried to make them three-dimensional human beings, which is not typically how Asian women have been portrayed, and especially ones who've been used for sex or sold into slavery.
Because it was sex trafficking.
Yeah, it was sex trafficking.
Yes.
And
in 1907, yes.
So
okay.
It was, and we still have that today. So trying to write that was just, I had to use my imagination. And I thought, though, that probably they were a lot like me, only they were in a very different situation. So that was very difficult, I'd say. And I had to have some Chinese American friends read it and tell me what they thought. What do you think of this culturally? What am I getting wrong? What is there anything in here that's offensive? And that was nice to get their stamp of approval.
Right. And that's very important, I think, for any writer that's writing about any different culture. Very important. Well, Jennifer, what would you like to read for us today?
Okay. I'm just going to read the beginning of the book of The Woman in the Camphor Trunk. It's the second book in the Anna Blanc mystery series, but they stand alone. Los Angeles, California, 1908. Anna Blanc was the most beautiful woman ever to barrel down Long Beach Strand with the severed head of a Chinese man. The tin pail that contained the head banged painfully against her shins as she flew. The sand churned beneath her shoes, grinding the silk from her expensive Louis heels. The wind fought against her unwieldy ostrich plume hat, bending the feathers. Regrettably, she had not dressed for a hunt that morning. She had not planned to be hunted. Luckily, she was young. Anna jumped over a pile of seaweed, stirring a cloud of sandflies. She unpinned her hat with one hand and let it sail, gripping the heavy pail so tightly her knuckles whitened. The pail swung and bounced erratically, frustrating her strides. It stank like old fish, rotting pork, and things so vile she could not name them. She gagged, panted, and gagged again. In the distance, a roller coaster roared. She heard a shout behind her and looked back. A detective in gray suit burst from the shadows of the pier at a dead run. Though heartless and incompetent, he ran like an Olympian. He was gaining quickly. Anna ran harder, her waist cramping, her arms aching, her skirts thrashing about her legs like sea foam. She was beginning to think she had made a mistake stealing the severed head from the scene of a crime. But without the head, Mr. Yao would never get justice. She veered away from the water towards the bathhouse and the crowd at the pike, aware of heavy, hostile panting close behind her. Music exploded from a bandstand. A hard shove to her back launched her forward, and she fell, jarring her chin on the ground and biting her tongue. She tasted hot, rusty blood. The bucket's lid popped off, and the head rolled across the sand like a bowling ball. Anna crawled after it, gasping for breath that had been knocked clean out of her. She felt the detective's brutal hand grab her boot and tug so hard she feared her hip would separate. With a distinctly unladylike hiss, she kicked. Her boot connected with his man parts, and he dropped to the sand, howling. Anna gracefully regained her feet, scooped the head up with the bucket, replaced the lid, and bolted for the crowd. She heard him shout, "Stop!" People were starting to look. "Help, help!" Anna cried, hoping the crowd would think he was the villain, which in her mind he was. She gave a final grand effort, scrambling for her freedom, pushing herself as hard as her legs would carry her, leaving the detective behind. As the great orange sun kissed the horizon, the sea of people parted for Anna. Grim, scowling men formed a protective wall behind her, confronting the monster who was causing her distress. She flew past a peanut stand, a taffy concession, a fortune teller, and barkers guessing people's weights. She ran through popcorn smells, skirting the line for the roller coaster, and straight onto a crowded red car that was departing for Los Angeles. Her pleasure trip to the beach had not turned out as she'd planned, but stumbling upon crime scenes could not be planned. It was a horrible serendipity. Anna fixed her hair. She dabbed her face with a dainty handkerchief and slowed her breathing. A gentleman with a wooden leg offered her his seat. She took it and set the bucket down. It was as heavy as her heart. The other passengers held handkerchiefs to their noses. Luckily, Anna didn't look like she smelled, even when mussed. She leveled an accusatory stare at a nearby man who did. And then she cried for Mr. Yao.
That is great. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thanks. Thank you.
That
So
is
good.
great. And for listeners who haven't read this book yet, it gets even better, believe me. And I know you're hooked. That's such a great beginning. I just love it.
Thanks.
Well, Jennifer, I'm excited to ask you a few questions, and especially I'm going to focus mostly on your wonderful characters. But first, I just wanted to ask you again, I know, as you were saying, your novel was inspired by Alice Stebbins Wells, who in 1910 became the first woman police officer in LA. Is there any other little information or anecdote that you want to share with our listeners about this woman? Because I just feel there must be so much powerfulness in her history.
Well, no doubt there was, but not a lot has been written about her. A lot of the information I got from her were articles about her in the newspaper of the day and articles she wrote herself. So she's kind of been one of those really important people who was neglected because she was a woman. Excuse me, but I will share about another woman who's interesting, who was in Long Beach, which is adjacent to Los Angeles, And in 1908, she became a cop. And she was named Fanny Bixby. She was young, beautiful, single, daughter of one of the wealthiest men in California. And she carried handcuffs and a gun, and she patrolled the boardwalk. And sometimes she got beat up, and she just kept going. And her family was horrified. And I thought, wow, I learned about her after I wrote The Secret Life of Anna Blanc. And I'm like, there's my Anna Blanc, and she was real.
Wow.
So I think she's
Amazing.
very interesting, and of course she was a like Alice Stebbins Wells. She was a powerful woman who really worked for social change.
These are women that really believed, they walked their talk, right? They really believed passionately.
Absolutely.
What are some of the challenges that a writer faces when they're fictionalizing history?
Well, there's a lot of fictionalized history taught all over the world. um, but you're making a hole in the past. And I differentiate between history and the past because they're really two different things. So you're making a hole in the past and you're dropping in your characters. Um, but history is more whole than substance. There are vast gaps and real biases in the stories that we tell about the past and that we learn in school, especially the way I learned history, which was a very sanitized version. And again, the women were left out and the people of color were left out. And our assumptions about the past that are based on that history can be totally off base. So, and then we have other ideas about the past based on media. Like I've had one woman say, she was a reader that said a woman would never act like that back then. And the implication is that women were fundamentally different in the 1900s. They were docile, they were unambitious, they were accepting, they were passive. And those qualities may have been sort of idealized, but women themselves haven't changed. And, there were a lot of activists, scientists, writers, artists, and the women were the driving force behind the progressive era, the progressive movement. They were the ones that were pushing for unions, for child labor laws, for the 8-hour work week, for all kinds of reforms. And they were the ones who were responsible for getting women into police work, for getting them in the jails to protect the women inmates from the policemen and the jailers who were raping them, and to getting women in police stations as well. So I think part of the challenge of writing a historical fiction is dealing with people's misconceptions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is very interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense. And that is a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think people think about like they go, okay, 1900s, that's kind of near Little House on the Prairie, and they think of Caroline Ingalls. What were women like? Well, they were like Little House on the Prairie, and they weren't.
Yeah.
So
That's great. Your character, Police Matron Clemens, intrigues me. She's an older working woman than Anna, and my imagination is just triggered over how much she saw in her lifetime. And in your book, The Woman in the Camphor Trunk, she says at one point to Anna this fantastic quote. I just love it. Now I kind of am living by it because I just love it. So quote, she says to Anna, "To walk a mile is a trial. To walk a yard is hard. But inch by inch, it's a cinch." Would you chat a little bit about this interesting character, Police Matron Clemens, and also this philosophical thought of hers?
Yeah, I came across that saying in something I was reading. It's from the time. Um, and now I can't remember where I got it. I have it somewhere in my notes, but it's original to the time. Um, and when I was inspired to write the book, I wanted to write it in honor of Alice Stebbins Wells, and of course, Anna's nothing like Anna Stebbins Wells. So, or Alice Stebbins Wells. So I thought I'd make Matron Clemens a little bit like Alice, and also the first police matron in Los Angeles in 1888 was, oh, now I'm forgetting her name. Okay, it'll come to me. Anyway, she became a police matron very late in life. She had an enormous brood of children, and she moved into the jail and she worked 7 days a week, and someone else cared for her kids, and she was just tirelessly serving the inmates. And I kind of combined those two historical people, the little I know about them, and reflected them into Matron Clemens.
That's great. She's just captivating for me. I hope that I'm going to get to see more of her in your next books because she was so great.
Well, I love her because, I think secretly she's just cheering Anna on. She has this very like sort of not just very stern countenance, but inside she's just cheering for Anna, and I love the way they interact. And she's a smart, tough woman, and she's seen it all. She's seen it all. And in book 3, I get into more of what the matrons see, and it's a lot.
Oh, great! Yeah. Okay, I'm waiting. Well, I'll tell you also, I just love Jo Singer, your character. So, as women's evolutionary journey continues, so too must the men's journey. And at one point, he says to Anna, quote, all the other girls in LA, they're on their best behavior around a man. They're acting modest, playing it coy, but not you. You're on your worst behavior all the time. And then Anna, at one point, she reflects that she'd been insulted by Jo Singer on many occasions, but she'd never been dismissed. Can you talk about your character, Jo Singer, and his complex working and non-working relationship with Anna?
Yeah, well, that's a backhanded compliment, that thing about being on her worst behavior all of the time, because that's really what he loves about her. She's really fighting for her individuality. She's fighting against those social norms of being docile and being, just not having agency. So that's a backhanded compliment, and it's very honest. Jo Singer's very honest, and so sometimes he says things to Anna that might be hard for her to hear. But he loves her. He just absolutely loves her and her bad behavior, and she drives him crazy. But it puts him in a very tough position because he wants a traditional family. And he wants Anna, who isn't very wifely, who isn't very traditional, who doesn't want to be a wife. Mm-hmm. And they're absolutely smitten with each other. So it's a big problem. As far as professionally, he respects her. He sees how smart she is. And there's a couple times in both books, I think, where he says, you're the smartest man on the force. But, he also wants to protect her. So he loves her. He wants to protect her. And if she's going to do her sleuthing, she's putting herself in terrible danger. So again, there's another big conflict there that he has to wrestle with. But they're always going to have conflict. She's never going to obey him. And he's okay with that in principle. But sexism is deeply ingrained in all of us. And it's kind of our default setting. So he's always going to be struggling with that. And as will Anna.
Interesting. Detective Wolf, he is also an interesting character. His first appearance in your book, The Woman in the Camphor Trunk, Anna notes that he's in a gray suit, quote, he's wafting lavender cologne and brilliantine. He was handsome in an oily way. His teeth gleamed white. Can you tell our listeners a little more about this Detective Wolf?
He's one of my favorite characters. I really have an affection for him, even though he's a masher. He's a bachelor, so he really, really, really loves Joe. He is Joe's true friend. They're the best of friends, and he loves to tease Joe. And he's also in love with Anna, which makes another uncomfortable little love triangle. And he would never, make a move on Anna for serious because he loves Joe. But it's that tension there. Anna's oblivious to the fact that Wolf is smitten with her, but Joe is not. But Wolf is kind of, he's not an upstanding guy, especially looking through the lens of the Me Too movement. He seduces young women, but he also has this other heroic side that comes out in The Woman in the Camphor Trunk. And I think he'd give his life for Joe or Anna.
Yeah, I feel like that too. He's a very, very interesting character. Now, Jennifer, it's one thing not to play by the rules with the societal mores or the bureaucracy, but Anna doesn't always play by the rules when it comes to crime scenes and evidence, for example. Mm-hmm. Why does she feel compelled to do this? Is she just impulsive?
Well, she is impulsive. There's no getting around that. But when rules come between her and solving crimes, she's going to break them. So the only thing Anna loves in the world, as much as Joe Singer, is solving crimes. And she's totally confident she'll be able to do it. And she's going to do it her way. So she knows that she's brilliant and she's educated herself. So if she feels like she needs to bend a rule, she's going to do it.
She certainly does. She can get herself into some real trouble. Listeners, you've got to read this and find out. Well, what are the challenges and what are the advantages that you had by setting Anna's home in Los Angeles?
Well, I love LA. I'm from LA. It's a joy to do the research. There's always kind of been this very forward-looking attitude in LA from the from the 1900s on, where instead of sort of treasuring historic buildings, we mowed them over and built brilliant new ones, looking to the future. So in a way, there's not a lot of LA that looks like the LA that Anna Blanc inhabited. And there's very limited documentation on Chinatown. And I talked about that before. There's kind of a lot of stuff in the newspaper, but it's a white racist perspective. And the other challenge I have is that the LAPD will not share their information. They will not open up their archives to anybody. And I was talking to James Elroy, and he, of course, is, the LA crime writer, and he has lots of friends in the LAPD, and they won't show him his files. They won't show them his files. And you have to get permission from the chief of police to get access to the old archives. And guess what? He's not giving it to me. So
wow.
There's a museum, LAPD museum, but it's volunteer run. It's not an LAPD thing. And there's almost nothing written on the period, but there's a lot of primary sources still around. But again, that's a white perspective.
Interesting.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for letting us grill you with these questions.
My pleasure.
And I'm going to go into my quick segment called It's All About the Voice. Writer's voice is an intrinsic and intimate perspective unique to each writer, unless you're writing to create a pastiche or an homage to, say, Jane Austen or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chris Fries says in an article in Writer's Digest, your voice is yourself in the story. And sometimes agents and editors will say, that they don't feel the voice in the story. But what is voice really? It's not style, it's not word choice, it's not dialogue by itself. Stephen King, in his excellent book on writing, says, "You may find yourself adopting a style you find particularly exciting, and there's nothing wrong with that. When I read Ray Bradbury as a kid, I wrote like Ray Bradbury, everything green and wondrous and seen through a lens smeared with the grease of nostalgia. When I read James N. Cain, everything I wrote came out clipped and stripped and hard-boiled. When I read Lovecraft, my prose became luxurious and Byzantine. I wrote stories in my teenage years where all those styles merged, creating a kind of hilarious stew. I'm guessing that's probably not the best approach for any writer. The best explanation for voice that I've found is something along these lines. Voice is personality on the page, something from the writer, of the writer, often subconsciously, that bleeds through topic, genre, characters, tone, word choice, sentence structure, everything. If you can see and feel the difference between books written by Agatha Christie and Elizabeth George, between Tom Clancy and Vince Flynn, or between Robert Ludlum and John le Carré, you are noticing the importance and the difference of voice. It draws the reader in, and truly in a series is like the voice of a best friend, making the reader welcome. So how does a beginning writer develop voice or build on voice? Here are a few quick suggestions. Pay attention to what you're paying attention to in the world around you. What attracts and what repels? Write about it. Have a point of view and use your voice without preaching. Give yourself permission to say those things you're thinking in your own unique way. Read your writing aloud. It's so much different than just hearing it in your head. Most likely, it will sound authentic, or not. You'll know the difference. I just read a wonderful interview with the late great writer Ursula Le Guin, recorded with David Naiman several years ago, where she talked about this very subject. She said, "I hear what I write. You can't find your own voice if you aren't listening for it. The sound of your writing is an essential part of what it's doing." In closing, here's another suggestion from the wonderful Stephen King. And if you don't have his book called On Writing, it truly deserves a place on your bookshelf. Or if you just love his books, you'll enjoy this book as well. He said, "The best way to develop your writer's voice is to read a lot and write a lot. There's really no other way to do it." Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Julie. Well, today I wanted to talk a little about messages with a cause with a little help from our friends. So the power of the written word is an important part of any impassioned argument. In addition to women's writings about the women's suffrage movement, for example, their efforts were supported by some men. I want to thank for this information and credit Lorianne LeBrun, who wrote a Turning Point Suffragist Memorial article, 7 Suffragist Men and the Importance of Allies. As she says in her article, male allies were vital to the success of the women's suffrage movement. At that time, men had the advantage of being influential at the polls and in government, and there were men who wrote as activists who reasoned and believed that women having the vote was the right thing to do. Many men helped by writing, speaking in favor of suffrage, signing petitions, and funding projects. Today, there are campaigns like the United Nations Women's He for She that encourage men to continue participating in the fight for gender equity. He for She works for cultural and social change as well as institutional change. Check it out at heforshe.org, heforshe.org. Here are just a few of the men activists in history for women's suffrage. Frederick Douglass, better known for his work as an abolitionist, He wrote in support of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Women's Rights Convention, including, quote, all that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman. And if that government is only just, which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise or a hand in making and administering the laws of the land. Then there was George Francis Train. He provided his services as a speaker and developed, launched, and funded the Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton women's rights newspaper called The Revolution. Thetis W. Sims was a Tennessee congressman. He showed his intense dedication to women's rights in 1918 when he showed up to vote for suffrage with an unset broken arm and shoulder. He not only cast his vote, but stayed in pain to persuade any hesitant congressman. James Mott was the husband of suffragist Lucretia Mott. He served as chairman of the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention and was one of the men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments. This declaration is a document signed in 1848 by 68 women and 32 men at the first Women's Rights Convention to be organized by women. Quote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And so on it continues. You can Google it. That's the Declaration of Sentiments. Daniel Anthony, that's Susan B. Anthony's father. He was a dedicated women's rights advocate and an important role model for his daughter. When his daughter's school refused to teach girls math and other subjects, Daniel Anthony opened a school where girls and boys were taught as equals. Education is key. Just a couple more that I wanted to go over. Henry Blackwell served as an editor of what would eventually become the official newspaper of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the Woman's Journal. And Francis Minor was a lawyer and women's rights advocate. In 1869, he wrote a pamphlet declaring that based on the wording of the 14th Amendment, national women's suffrage was already legal. When his wife was refused to vote in 1872, he filed a lawsuit against the registrar. His case made it to the Supreme Court, but unfortunately they were ruled against. Never underestimate the power of the written word. And now I'd like to give you a book recommendation in addition to recommending our guests' books. My recommendation is The Screaming of the Innocent by Unity Dow. This author was the first female high court judge in Botswana, and she participated in a landmark case concerning Bushman rights. She's a human rights activist and the author of 4 books. Her books deal with issues concerning the struggle between Western and traditional values. They also involve her interest in gender issues and her nation's poverty. She was raised in a rural background and traditional African values. She studied law at the University of Botswana and Swaziland, which included 2 years studying at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. In The Screaming of the Innocent, a young girl vanishes, and police guess she was eaten by a lion. The reader knows that she's been ritually murdered for body parts that are said to give great powers. It's years later when a female student doing national service comes across a box of clothing belonging to the missing girl. When she brings this box of clothing to light, the box mysteriously disappears. The author writes from a purely African perspective, which enhances the reader's experience. The heroine doggedly pursues resolution, following twists and turns to a truly African-style ending. Now, I'm wondering what Jennifer would recommend to our listeners. Jennifer?
Sure. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this author's name correctly because it's unfamiliar to me, but I'm going to do my best. It's Asma Zehanat Khan, and she wrote a novel called A Dangerous Crossing. It's a mystery set in Canada dealing with Syrian refugees and politics, and it is so vivid and so captivating. Two Canadian cops, a woman and a man, are searching for the missing sister of a friend who's wanted in connection with two murders at a refugee camp. And I'm listening to it on audio, and it's just fantastic. I recommend it for its depth and the way that it portrays complex issues, and just it's a solid mystery.
Great. Can you spell her last name for us?
Khan.
Okay, Khan. All right. Terrific. It's one I haven't heard of, and I'm going to look forward to finding that. Well, today, in keeping with our theme on voice, I'm suggesting that those of you with young daughters, granddaughters, or nieces check out a website and an organization called girlsrightnow.org. It's based in New York City, and they just celebrated their 20th anniversary of mentoring, volunteering, and fundraising. They cover scholarships, therapy assistance, and career and college guidance for girls, along with encouraging writing. Girls Right Now was named one of New York City's top 10 best places to volunteer, and Maya Nussbaum of Girls Right Now was also named a White House Champion of Change back during Obama's term. I truly wish that such an organization existed in our very bookish city of Seattle. Maybe we need to start one here. I'd volunteer for that. Well, in closing, I came across this quote from writer Nora Ephron, which was so very appropriate to our topic today. Here goes. Whatever you choose, however many roads you travel, I hope that you choose not to be a lady. I hope you will find some way to break the rules and make a little trouble out there. And I also hope that you will choose to make some of that trouble on behalf of women. Our special thanks to mystery writer Jennifer Kincheloe for the interview today. Thank you for your insights on research and writing historical mysteries and exploring the voices of women during a critical time period in American history. We're so glad you could join us. Keep reading and keep writing.